Wherever he goes, whatever he does, Paddington brings confusion and consternation. But things always turn out all right in the end. Here are more adventures of the remarkable bear from darkest Peru, who now lives in London with Mr. and Mrs. Brown and their children, Judy and Jonathan, and their housekeeper, Mrs. Bird. These stories all come from Michael Bond's book, Paddington Takes the Air. And we begin with a story called A Visit to the Dentist.
Paddington stared at Mrs. Brown as if he could hardly believe his ears. "You've dropped my tooth down the waste disposal?" he exclaimed. "I shan't even be able to put it under my pillow now." Mrs. Brown peered helplessly into the gaping hole at the bottom of her kitchen sink. "I'm awfully sorry, dear," she replied. "It must have been in the leavings when I cleared up after breakfast. I think you'll have to leave a note explaining what happened." It was a tradition in the Browns' household that anyone who lost a tooth and left it under their pillow that night would find it replaced by 5 pence the next morning, and Paddington looked most upset at being deprived of this experience. "Perhaps we could try looking under the cover outside," suggested Judy hopefully. "It might still be in the drain." "I shouldn't think so," said Jonathan. "Those waste disposals are jolly good. They grind up everything. It even managed that everlasting toffee Paddington gave me yesterday. Oh, it was a super one," he added hastily as he caught Paddington's eye. "I wish I could make one half as nice. It was a bit big, though. I couldn't quite finish it." "Well," said Mr. Brown, returning to the vexed question of Paddington's tooth, "at least it didn't jam the machine. We've only had it a fortnight." Paddington gave him a very hard stare indeed. "I've had that tooth since I was born," he said, "and it was my best one. I don't know what Aunt Lucy's going to say when I write and tell her." And with that parting shot he hurried out of the kitchen and disappeared upstairs in the direction of his room, leaving behind a very unhappy group of Browns indeed. "I don't see how anyone can have a best tooth," said Mr. Brown, as he made ready to leave for the office. "Well," said Mrs. Bird, the housekeeper, "best or not, I must say I don't blame that bear. I don't think I'd be too happy at the thought of one of my teeth going down a waste disposal, even if it was an accident." "It would have to be Paddington's," said Judy. "You know how he hates losing anything, especially when it's something he's cleaned twice a day." "We shall never hear the last of it," agreed Mrs. Brown. She looked round the kitchen at the remains of the breakfast things. "Oh, I do hate Mondays. I don't know why, but there always seems to be more dried egg on the plates than any other day." The others fell silent. It was one of those mornings at number 32 Windsor Gardens. Things had started badly when Paddington announced that he'd found a bone in his boiled egg. But remembering a similar occurrence some years before with the Christmas pudding, the Browns had pooh-poohed the idea at first, and it wasn't until a little later on, when he'd gone upstairs to do his Monday morning accounts, that the trouble had really begun. A sudden cry of alarm had brought the rest of the family racing to the scene, only to find Paddington on his bed with a pencil stuck between a large gap where one of his back teeth should have been. Immediately, the whole house had been in an uproar. The bed was stripped, carpets were turned back, the vacuum cleaner was emptied, pockets turned out. Paddington even tried standing on his head in case he'd swallowed the lost half by mistake, but all to no avail. It was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't until Mrs. Bird remembered the episode with the boiled egg that they suddenly put 2 and 2 together and went scurrying back downstairs again as fast as their legs would carry them. But they were too late. Before they were halfway down, they heard a loud grinding noise coming from the kitchen, and they arrived just in time to see Mrs. Brown switch the machine off. The waste disposal was still a new toy in the household. Everything from used matchsticks to old bones were fed into its ever-open mouth. But never in her wildest moments would Mrs. Brown have dreamed of disposing of one of Paddington's teeth, and she was as upset as anyone when she realised what had happened. "I can't see them taking him on the National Health," she said. "Perhaps he'd better go to the vet." "Certainly not," said Mrs. Bird decidedly. He'll have to go as a private patient. I'll ring Mr. Leach straight away." Although the Browns' housekeeper kept a firm hand on Paddington's goings-on, she was always quick to come to his aid in time of trouble, and she bustled out of the room in a very determined manner. All the same, the others awaited her return with some anxiety, for although Mr. Leach had looked after the family's teeth for more years than they cared to remember, he'd never actually been asked to deal with one of Paddington's before. They weren't at all sure how he would view the matter, but their spirits rose when Mrs. Bird reappeared, wearing her coat and hat. "Mr. Leach will see him as soon as we can get there," she announced. "He keeps a free period for emergencies." Mrs. Brown heaved a sigh of relief. "Oh, how nice! It's not as if we've ever registered Paddington with him." "Who said anything about Paddington?" replied Mrs. Bird innocently. "I simply said we have an emergency in the house." She glanced up at the ceiling as a loud groan came from somewhere overhead. "And if you ask me, there's no one who'll deny the truth of that. I'd better order a taxi." While Mrs. Bird got busy on the phone again, the others hurried upstairs to see how Paddington was getting on. They found him sitting on the side of his bed, wearing a very woe-begone expression on his face, or rather the little of his face that could be seen, for most of it was concealed behind a large bath towel. Every so often a low groan issued from somewhere deep inside the folds, and if the news of his forthcoming visit to the dentist did little to raise his spirits, they received a further setback a few minutes later when he was ushered into the back of a waiting taxi. "Oh, having trouble with your choppers then, mate?" asked the driver, catching sight of the towel. "My choppers?" exclaimed Paddington. "Yes, I only hope your dentist ain't a strong union man," continued the driver as they moved away. "Oh, you know, one out, the lot out." Mrs. Brown hastily closed the window between the two compartments. "Don't take any notice, dear," she said. "I'm sure you're doing the right thing. Mr. Leach is very good. He's been practising for years." "Mr. Leach has been practising?" repeated Paddington with growing alarm. "I think I'd sooner pay extra and have someone who knows what he's doing." The Browns exchanged glances. It was sometimes very difficult explaining things to Paddington, especially when he had his mind firmly fixed on something else. And they completed the rest of the journey in silence. If Paddington himself was beginning to have mixed feelings on the subject of his tooth, Mr. Leach had no such problems when they reached his surgery a short while later. "I'm afraid I shall have to charge extra," he said, as the situation was explained to him. "Bears have 42 teeth." "I've only got 41, said Paddington. "One of mine's been disposed of." That's still 9 more than I normally deal with," said Mr. Leach firmly, ushering Paddington into his surgery. "None of my charts cover it for a start. I shall have to get my nurse to draw up a completely new one." "I do hope we are doing the right thing," said Mrs. Brown anxiously, as the door closed behind them. "I feel it's all my fault." Mrs. Bird gave a snort. "More likely that bear's everlasting toffees," she said grimly. "They're well named. It's almost impossible to get rid of them. It's no wonder he's lost a tooth. He was testing them all day yesterday. I had to throw the saucepan away, and there were toffees all over the kitchen floor. I nearly ripped my ankle twice." Paddington's homemade toffees were a sore subject in the Brown household. It wasn't so much that they had set hard. In fact, had they done so, there might have been fewer complaints, but they ended up as a pile of large, glutinous balls which stuck to everything they came in contact with, and Mrs. Bird spent the next few minutes holding forth on what she would like to do with them. However, it was noticeable that all the while she was talking, the Browns' housekeeper kept her gaze firmly fixed on the door leading to the surgery, rather as if she wished she had X-ray eyes. But as it happened, for once, Mrs. Bird's worst fears weren't being realised, for Paddington was beginning to have second thoughts about dentists. Looking round Mr. Leach's surgery, he decided it was all very much nicer than he'd expected. Everything was gleaming white and spotlessly clean, with not a marmalade stain to be seen anywhere. And although it wasn't what Mrs. Bird would have called over-furnished, the one chair Mr. Leach did possess more than made up for the fact. Paddington had never come across anything quite like it before. It was like a long couch which rose into the air and took on all kinds of shapes simply at the press of a button. It seemed very good value indeed, and Paddington was most impressed. Above his head there was a nice warm lamp, and just beside his left paw there was a glass of pinkish liquid and a basin, while on the other side, next to Mr. Leach, there was a table fixed to an arm on which a number of instruments were laid. Paddington hastily averted his gaze from these as he settled back in the chair. But he liked anything new, and despite his aching tooth, he dutifully opened his mouth and eyed Mr. Leach with interest as the latter picked up a small rod-like object and what looked like a mirror on the end of a stick. Mr. Leach gave several grunts of approval as he peered into Paddington's mouth, tapping the teeth one by one with the end of the rod, and several times he broke into song as he delved deeper and deeper. We've got a good one there, Bear," he said, standing up at last. "I'm glad you came along." Paddington sat up, looking most relieved. "Thank you very much, Mr. Leach," he exclaimed. "That didn't hurt a bit." Mr. Leach looked slightly taken aback. "I haven't done anything yet," he said. "That was only an inspection, just to see what's what. We've a long way to go yet. I'm afraid you have a fractured cusp." "What?" exclaimed Paddington. "My cusp's fractured?" He peered at the rod in Mr. Leach's hand. "It was all right when I came in," he added. "I think it must have happened when you tapped it." "A fractured cusp merely means you have a broken tooth." Mr. Leach wagged his finger roguishly. "I have a feeling we've been eating something we shouldn't." Paddington sank back in his chair and looked at the dentist with renewed interest. "Have you been making toffee too, Mr. Leach?" he exclaimed. Mr. Leach gave Paddington a strange look. "You have quite a large piece of double tooth missing," he said, slowly and carefully, "and I shall have to make you a new top to replace it." Looking most upset at this latest piece of news, Paddington reached out a paw for the nearby glass of pink liquid. "I think I'll have my orangeade now, Mr. Leach, if you don't mind," he exclaimed. "That," said Mr. Leach sternly, "is not orangeade. It's not even for drinking. It's put there so that you can swill your mouth out and get rid of the bits and pieces after I've finished drilling. If I kept every young bear who came in here supplied with free drinks, I'd soon be out of business." He looked distastefully at Paddington's front, where the fur had already become rather soggy from the drips, and then signalled his nurse to tie a plastic bib round Paddington's neck. "Would we like an injection?" he asked. "It may hurt otherwise." "Yes, please," said Paddington promptly. "I'll have 2 if you like." "I think 1 will be sufficient," replied Mr. Leach, holding a syringe up to the light. "Now, open your mouth wide, please," he continued. "And don't forget, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you." Paddington dutifully obeyed Mr. Leach's instructions, and in fact, apart from a slight prick, it was much less painful than he'd expected. "Shall I do yours now, Mr. Leach?" he asked. Mr. Leach gave him a strange look. "Mine?" he replied. "I don't have an injection." Paddington gave Mr. Leach an equally strange look in return. "You said we were going to have one," he persisted. "And you said yours would hurt more than mine." Mr. Leach stared at Paddington for a moment, as if he could hardly believe his ears, and then turned to his nurse. "I think," he said, breathing heavily, "we'll try putting a wedge in his mouth. It may make things easier. Now," he continued, turning back to Paddington as the nurse handed him a piece of plastic-looking material, "now I want you to open your mouth again, say ah, and when I've put this in, take a good hard bite." Paddington opened his mouth and let out a loud ah. "Good," said Mr. Leach approvingly as he reached into the opening. "Now, one more ah like that, and then a good hard bite. And whatever happens from now on, don't let go." "Ah," said Paddington. Mr. Leach's face seemed to change colour suddenly. "Oh!" he cried. "Oh!" repeated Paddington, biting harder than ever. "Ow!" shouted Mr. Leach as he began dancing up and down. "Ow!" called Paddington, nearly falling out of the chair in his excitement. "Ow! Ouch!" shrieked Mr. Leach. "Ow! Ooh! Outside in the waiting room, the Browns looked anxiously at one another. "Poor old Paddington," said Jonathan. "Sounds as if he's going through it." "I do hope it doesn't take much longer," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't know about Paddington, but I'm not sure if I can stand a lot more." As it happened, Mrs. Brown's prayers were answered almost before the words were out of her mouth. For at that moment the surgery door burst open and a white-faced nurse appeared in the opening. "Can you come quickly?" she cried. Mrs. Brown clutched at her throat. "Paddington! He's not—" "No," said the nurse, "he's not. We haven't even started on him yet. It's Mr. Leach we're having trouble with." Mrs. Bird hurried into the surgery, clutching her umbrella. "Whatever's going on?" she demanded. "Ah!" replied Paddington. "Ooh!" shrieked Mr. Leach. "Wow! Ow! Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan, as he and Judy dashed towards the chair where Paddington and Mr. Leach appeared to be inextricably locked together. "You grab Mr. Leach," cried Judy, "and I'll pull Paddington." Well, a moment later, Mr. Leach staggered back across the room. "My thumb," he said, slowly and distinctly, as he glared at the occupant of the chair. "My thumb, or what's left of it, was caught under your wedge, Bear." Paddington put on his injured expression. "You said bite hard and not let go whatever happened, Mr. Leach," he explained. Mrs. Brown gazed anxiously at the dentist as he stood in the middle of the surgery nursing his injury. "Would you like us to come back another day?" she asked doubtfully. Mr. Leach appeared for a moment to be undergoing some kind of deep internal struggle, and then he took a grip of himself. "No," he said at last. "No. When I became a dentist, I knew there would be days when things wouldn't always go right." He looked at Paddington and then reached for his drill. "I've had 20 most enjoyable years. I suppose it had to come to an end sometime, and I'm certainly not letting a bear's cusp get the better of me now." It was a little while before Paddington emerged again from Mr. Leach's surgery, and although all had remained quiet, the Browns were relieved to see him looking none the worse for his experience. Indeed, as he hurried into the waiting room, holding his mouth open for all to see, he looked positively excited. "Mr. Leach is going to give me a new gold tooth," he announced importantly. "My cusp's so large he doesn't think an ordinary one would stand the strain." Mr. Leach permitted himself a smile as he hovered in the doorway, nursing a bandaged thumb. "I think we're winning at long last," he said. "I'd like to see young Mr. Brown again next week for a final fitting." "Thank you very much, Mr. Leach," said Paddington gratefully. Bending down, he undid his suitcase, withdrew a large paper bag, and held it out. "Perhaps you'd like to try one of these?" Mr. Leach hesitated. "Well, I don't normally indulge," he said, peering into the bag. "It doesn't set a very good example. But I must say they look very tempting. It's very kind of you. As he placed one of Paddington's everlasting toffees into his mouth, Mr. Leach's voice trailed away, and for the second time that morning his face took on a glazed expression. he gurgled, pointing to his mouth. It's thawing! It's thawing! Paddington peered at him with interest. "I hope you haven't fractured one of your cusps now, Mr. Leech," he said anxiously. Mr. Leech glared at him for a moment and then staggered back into his surgery, clutching his jaw. Far from being fractured, his cusps gave the impression that they were cemented together for all time, and the look on his face as he slammed the door boded ill for the next patient on his list that morning. Paddington looked most upset. "I only thought he would like one to be going on with," he exclaimed. "Going on with is right," said Mrs. Bird grimly, as a series of muffled exclamations reached their ears. "By the sound of things, it'll be going on until this time next week." She held out her hand. "I know something else that's due to be disposed of just as soon as we get home. We've had quite enough Bear's everlasting toffee for one day." Judy squeezed Paddington's paw as they climbed into a taxi to take them home. "Never mind," she whispered. "There can't be many bears who are able to say they're having a gold tooth made for them." "I'll tell you something else," said Mrs. Brown. "It'll make you even more valuable than you are at the moment. While you have a gold tooth in your head, you'll never be completely without, whatever else happens." Paddington digested this latest piece of information for a moment or two as he settled back in his seat. So much had happened that morning that he felt he'd have a job to remember it all, let alone put it down on a postcard when he next wrote to his Aunt Lucy in Peru. But all in all, he was beginning to feel rather pleased at the way things had turned out, and he felt sure she would be equally delighted by the news. Mrs. Bird glanced across at him with the suspicion of a twinkle in her eye. "If this morning's events are anything to go by," she said, "it strikes me that a tooth in the sink is worth 2 under the pillow any day of the week." Paddington nodded his agreement. "I think," he announced at last, amid sighs of relief, "I think I'll always have my old teeth disposed of in future." Mrs. Bird held a large square of checkered cloth up to the light and examined it with an expert eye. "I must say Paddington's made a first-class job of it," she declared approvingly. "I've seen worse in some shops," agreed Mrs. Brown. "What is it?" "I think he said it's a tablecloth," replied Mrs. Bird. "But whatever it is, I'm sure it'll come in very handy." Mrs. Brown glanced up at the ceiling as a steady, rhythmic clanking came from somewhere overhead. "At least we can leave him on his own for the day without worrying too much," she said thankfully. "We may as well make the most of it. At the rate he's going, that sewing machine won't last much longer." Paddington's interest in sewing had been something of a 9-day wonder in the Brown household. It all came about when he lost his 15p a week bun money down a drain one morning as he was on his way to the baker's to pick up his standing order. The coins had slipped through a hole in one of his duffel coat pockets, and even the combined efforts of several passing dustmen and a road sweeper had failed to locate them. Although Mr. Brown took pity on him and replaced the money, Paddington had been upset for several days afterwards. It was Mr. Gruber who finally took his mind off the matter. Mr. Gruber kept an antique shop in the nearby Portobello Market, and over the years he and Paddington had become firm friends. In fact, most mornings they shared some buns and a cup of cocoa for their 11s. Well, one morning, shortly after his loss, Paddington arrived at the shop only to find a mysterious, cloth-covered object standing on a table just inside the door. At Mr. Gruber's bidding, he lifted the cloth, and then, nearly fell over backwards with surprise, for there, lo and behold, was a sewing machine. And even more exciting, on the side there was a label with his name on it. Mr. Gruber waved Paddington's thanks to one side. "We don't want another day like the one we don't talk about in a hurry, Mr. Brown," he said, referring to the bunless Friday as they'd come to know it. "I'm afraid it's rather an old one," he continued, as Paddington examined the machine with interest. "It came in a job lot I bought at a sale many years ago, and it's been lying under a chair at the back of my shop ever since. But there's a book of instructions, and it may do a turn if you want to go over some of your old seams." Well, Paddington didn't know what to say. Although Mrs. Bird had unpicked the join on his duffel coat pocket and inserted a double-strength calico lining to make doubly sure for the future, he didn't want to take any more chances. And after thanking Mr. Gruber very much, he hurried home with the present safely tucked away in his shopping basket on wheels. Paddington had often watched Mrs. Bird in action with her machine, and once she'd even let him turn the handle, but never in his wildest dreams had he pictured actually owning one himself. Threading the needle by paw had been his biggest problem, and the first time it had taken him the best part of a day, but once the cotton was safely through the eye of the needle, there was no holding him, and soon the steady clickety-clack of the machine had begun to echo round the house. At first he'd contented himself with joining together some old bits of cloth Mrs. Bird had found in her sewing box. But when these ran out, he turned his attention to more ambitious things, and really and truly he'd been most useful. A new tea-towel for Mrs. Bird, a set of curtains for Judy's doll's house, a bag for Jonathan's cricket bat, and a smaller one for Mr. Brown's pipe. Now the tablecloth. There seemed no end to his activities. "Just so long as he doesn't do anything nasty to his new eiderdown," said Mrs. Bird as they went upstairs to give Paddington his instructions for lunch. "I don't want to come back and find it turned into a tea cosy." Although the Browns' housekeeper was as pleased as anyone over Paddington's newfound industry, she didn't entirely share Mrs. Brown's optimism about leaving him alone for the day. Nevertheless, even Mrs. Bird gave a nod of approval as they entered his room, and she caught sight of a pile of old handkerchiefs he was busy repairing. "That reminds me," said Mrs. Brown as they said goodbye. "The laundryman is due this morning. I've put the things by the front door. Now, Mr. Curry might call in later. He's got a pair of trousers he wants altered." Mrs. Bird gave a snort. "I shouldn't worry too much about that. It's only because there's a special offer of 5 pence off this week if repairs go to the laundry. If he's so mean he can't send any washing of his own, then it's too bad." It seemed just a matter of seconds after the front door closed behind them that another loud bang sent Paddington hurrying downstairs, only to find Mr. Curry waiting impatiently on the front doorstep. "Good morning, Bear," he said gruffly. "I'd like you to put these with your laundry. I want 2 inches off the waist," he continued, handing over a pair of grey flannel trousers. "No more, and certainly no less. The instructions are all on a sheet of paper in one of the pockets. I lost a lot of weight when I was in hospital last year, and I've never put it on again. All my clothes are the same." "Oh, dear, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "I'm sorry to hear that." "I want you to make sure they go in your name," Mr. Curry said. "It's most important. They're doing waistbands for 95 pence this week, and it's the last day of the offer." A thoughtful expression came over Paddington's face as he took the trousers from Mr. Curry. "I know someone who would do it for 15 pence, he said hopefully, "and give it back to you today." 15 pence? Repeated Mr. Curry. It seems remarkably cheap. Are you sure they'll do them in a day? Paddington nodded. It isn't a they, Mr. Curry. It's a he. Is this person completely reliable, Bear? asked Mr. Curry suspiciously. "Oh, yes," said Paddington confidently. Mr. Curry hesitated for a moment and then came to a decision. "Wait there, Bear," he said, turning to go. "This is too good an opportunity to miss." The Brown's neighbour was gone for several minutes, and while he was away, the man arrived to collect the weekly wash. Paddington hesitated over the trousers. Although the idea of doing them himself had seemed a very good one at the time, now that he'd taken a closer look, he was beginning to have second thoughts on the matter. And he was just about to chase after the van when he caught sight of Mr. Curry glaring at him through his bedroom window, and he hurriedly changed his mind again. A few moments later, the Brown's neighbour emerged from his door and headed back towards number 32. To Paddington's surprise, he was wearing a dressing gown and carrying a large brown paper parcel in his arms. "I've decided to go the whole hog, Bear," he announced as he came up the path. "If this person's as good as you say he is, it'll be well worthwhile." Paddington's face grew longer and longer as Mr. Curry unwrapped his parcel and revealed not one pair of trousers, but a great pile. "I'm having the whole lot done," explained Mr. Curry, "including," he added ominously, "including the ones from my best suit." "You wouldn't like to keep a pair in case of an emergency, would you, Mr. Curry?" asked Paddington anxiously. "An emergency?" barked Mr. Curry, catching sight of the look on Paddington's face. "I don't like the sound of that, Bear. Are you sure this person will do a good job? If not, I'd rather send them with your laundry." "I'm afraid it's too late now, Mr. Curry," said Paddington unhappily. "It's gone." Mr. Curry looked at Paddington sternly. "In that case," he warned, "I shall hold you personally responsible for the safety of my trousers from now on, and I shall look forward to their prompt return. I can't go out until they come back, so woe betide you if anything goes wrong. I may give you 5 pence for going," he added, as Paddington held out his paw hopefully. "It all depends, but I'm certainly not paying the full amount until I see some results." With that, the Brown's neighbour turned on his heels and disappeared in the direction of his house, leaving Paddington with a very woebegone expression on his face indeed. For some reason which he could never quite fathom, things always got out of hand when Mr. Curry was around, and Paddington was apt to find himself agreeing to do things before he knew what they actually were. Heaving a deep sigh, he gathered up Mr. Curry's parcel and made his way back upstairs in order to consult the instruction book. In the event, it proved rather disappointing. As far as he could make out, when the machine was first made, very few people seemed to wear trousers, or if they did, they were so well made that they were seldom in need of repair. Most of the illustrations dealt with some very odd situations indeed. There was a picture of a lady who'd caught her dress on a penny-farthing cycle, and another called Drama in the Desert, which showed a man with a large moustache and shorts repairing what was left of his tent after a camel had trodden on it. But any hints and tips to do with trousers as such were conspicuous only by their absence. Although Paddington was very keen on instruction books, he'd noticed in the past that they had a habit of dealing with every kind of situation except the one he most wanted, and the present one was no exception. However, Paddington wasn't the sort of bear to let things get the better of him if he could possibly help it, and picking up a pair of scissors, he poked hopefully at one of Mr. Curry's seams. To his surprise, his efforts were rewarded much sooner than he expected, for without any warning at all, the waistband suddenly parted in the middle. In fact, it was even more successful than he'd intended, for when he pulled at the loose thread, there was a rending sound, and it travelled right down to the turn-ups at the bottom. Paddington wasn't quite sure whether it was the direct result of pulling that thread or whether he'd pulled another one by mistake, but when he picked the trousers up to examine them more closely, one of the legs fell off. After drawing the bedroom curtains to be on the safe side, Paddington held the remaining leg up to his bedside light and peered at it uneasily. Now that matters had finally come to a head, he rather wished he'd sorted through the pile and picked on something other than the trousers from Mr. Curry's best navy blue pinstripe suit to practice on. On the other hand, when he looked at some of his efforts a little later on, he began to wonder if perhaps his first choice hadn't been the best one after all. At least the two halves had come apart cleanly, which was more than could be said for some of the older pairs of trousers. But it was when he tried sewing some of the halves together again that his troubles really started. It was much more difficult than he'd expected. In the past, most of the material he'd used had been thin and easy to work, whereas Mr. Curry's trousers seemed unusually thick. There were so many folds in his waistbands he soon lost count of them, and the handle of the machine became very hard to turn. In desperation, Paddington tried jamming it in one of his dressing-table drawers and turning the machine itself, but the only result of that was an ominous ping as the needle snapped. It was all most disappointing. After working away as hard as he could, with barely a pause for a marmalade sandwich at lunch, Paddington had to admit that the results fell somewhat short of even his own expectations, and he shuddered to think how far short they were of Mr. Curry's. As far as he could see, all he could offer the Brown's neighbour was a choice between a pair of trousers with 12-inch hips and pockets on the outside, one with a large gap in the back, a pair of grey flannel shorts with one leg longer than the other, some trousers with different coloured legs, or a kind of do-it-yourself selection from the pieces that were left over. Whichever Mr. Curry chose, Paddington couldn't picture him being exactly overjoyed, let alone paying 15 pence a time. He looked at the pile of material mournfully. For a wild moment he toyed with the idea of disguising his voice and ringing the Brown's neighbour to try and explain matters to him, but then he remembered that Mr. Curry wasn't on the phone anyway. All the same, the thought triggered off another idea in Paddington's mind, and a moment later, after consulting his instruction book again, he hurried downstairs. In the back of the Sew Right booklet was a note headed, "What to do if all else fails," and this was followed by an address to write to in case of an emergency. The man from the Sew Right emergency service stared round Paddington's room in amazement. "You're in a bit of a mess and no mistake," he said sympathetically. "What on earth's been going on?" "I'm afraid I've been having trouble with Mr. Curry's seams," said Paddington. "I've got rather a lot of his legs left over." "I can see that," said the man, picking up a handful. "This sort of thing isn't really our pigeon, but I suppose I might be able to pull a few strings for you." "I've tried pulling some threads," said Paddington, "but it only seemed to make things worse." The man gave Paddington an odd look, and then, glancing round the room again, he gave a sudden start. Is that yours?" he asked, pointing to the machine on the floor. "Well, yes," began Paddington. "Mr. Gruber gave it to me. I'm afraid it's rather an old one, so you may not like it very much." "Not like it?" cried the man, dashing to the door. "Not like it? Jim!" he shouted. "Jim! There's a young bear up here with one of our Mark Is." Paddington grew more and more mystified as a pounding of feet on the stairs heralded the approach of a second man. He wasn't at all sure what was going on, but he was thankful to see something happening at long last. Just you wait till our Mr. Bridges hears about this," exclaimed the first man as they made to leave. "He'll go berserk. You'll never hear the like again." "I expect I shall," said Paddington unhappily. "You wait until Mr. Curry hears about his trousers." Although the long-term prospects had begun to look much better than he dared expect, Paddington didn't view the immediate future at all hopefully, and as things turned out, his forecast proved all too correct. The roar of rage which issued from Mr. Curry's house a short while later, when the men from So Right broke the news about his trousers, followed Paddington all the way down Windsor Gardens, lasting almost as far as the Portobello Road, and he was very thankful indeed to reach the safety of Mr. Gruber's shop. While Paddington sat on the horsehair sofa mopping his brow, Mr. Gruber hastily made some cocoa, and a few minutes later they adjourned to their usual deck chairs on the pavement outside. Once there, Mr. Gruber settled back and listened patiently, while Paddington did his best to explain all that had taken place that day. It was a long story, and at the finish, Mr. Gruber looked as surprised at the outcome as Paddington had done. "What a bit of luck that old sewing machine I gave you turned out to be so valuable," he said. "I would never have guessed it. It only goes to show that even in this business there is always something to learn." "The man from So Right said it's one of their Mark I's, Mr. Gruber," replied Paddington. "He told me it must have been one of the first they ever made. They've been trying to find one like it for years to put in their museum, so it's probably worth a lot of money." "It's a good job they offered to repair Mr. Curry's trousers free of charge," chuckled Mr. Gruber, pouring out a second cup of cocoa by way of celebration. "We should never have heard the last of it otherwise. It seems to me you struck a very good bargain, Mr. Brown. Just think," he mused, "if you hadn't accidentally dropped your bun money down a drain, all this might never have happened. Big things sometimes have very small beginnings indeed." Paddington nodded his agreement behind the cocoa steam, and then hesitated as he felt in his duffel-coat pocket. Mr. Gruber read his thoughts. "I don't think it would be quite the same if you deliberately put some money down a drain, Mr. Brown," he said tactfully. "After all, I know lightning seldom strikes twice in the same place, but fate plays funny tricks sometimes." Paddington considered the matter for a moment. All in all, he decided Mr. Gruber was quite right, and it wasn't worth taking unnecessary risks. "I don't think I should like to see even Mr. Curry's trousers struck by lightning," he announced, "especially while they're still at the mender's." Paddington reined in his horse and stared at the judge's rostrum as if he could hardly believe his ears. "I've got 452 faults," he exclaimed hotly, "but I've only been round once." "There are 12 fences," said Gay Cheeseman, measuring his words with care. "And you went straight through all of them. That's 48 for a start, plus another 4 for going back over the last one. And," he added, bringing the subject firmly to a close as he glared down at the battered remnants of what had once been a hat, "and your horse trampled all over my best bowler, the one I intended wearing at the presentation this afternoon. That's another 400. The occasion was the end-of-term celebration at Judy's school, and instead of the usual speech-making, Miss Grimshaw, the headmistress, had decided to hold a gymkhana in aid of a new swimming pool. There were a number of events on the programme, and the two main items at the beginning and end were open to all and sundry, including the parents, relations, and friends of the pupils. The competitors were given sponsor sheets, and each had to collect as many signatures as possible from people who were prepared to pay a small sum for every successful jump. Paddington, who had decided to enter for both the events, had been kept very busy hurrying round the grounds collecting names for his sheet. He was already a familiar figure at Judy's school, and almost the entire upper and lower fourth, fifth and sixth forms had persuaded their nearest and dearest to sponsor him at anything between 5p and 50p a jump. In view of the number of signatures Paddington had managed to collect, the swimming pool fund stood to benefit by a tidy amount. Gay Cheeseman, the famous Olympic rider, had very kindly agreed to judge the contest and act as commentator, and with the sun shining down from a cloudless sky, the sound of horses' hooves pounding the turf, the murmur of the large crowd which had gathered round the sports field, and the creaking of innumerable picnic baskets, it promised to be a memorable occasion. The roar of excitement which went up as Paddington mounted his horse was equalled only by the groan of disappointment as he disappeared over the other side. And when he eventually reappeared facing the wrong way, an ominous silence fell over the field, a silence broken only by the crash of falling fences and a cry of rage from Mr. Cheeseman as he watched his best hat being ground to a pulp. Paddington was more upset than anyone, for although he'd never actually been on a horse before, let alone a jumping one, Mr. Gruber had lent him several very good books on the subject, and he'd spent the last few evenings sitting astride a puff in the Brown sitting-room, practising with a homemade whip and some stirrups made from a pair of Jonathan's old handcuffs. It was all most disappointing. In fact, he rather wished now that he'd chosen something else to practice on. To start with, the horse was very much taller and harder than he'd expected, more iron and steel than flesh and blood. And whereas by gripping the puff between his knees he'd been able to hop around the house at quite a speed, it was nothing compared with Black Beauty once she got going. That apart, aside from when he'd unexpectedly bumped into Mrs. Bird in the hall, he'd never attempted any kind of jumps on the puff. And no matter what he shouted to Black Beauty, she seemed to have it firmly fixed in her mind that the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line, regardless of what happened to be in the way. "Never mind, Paddington," said Judy, grabbing hold of the reins. "We all thought you did jolly well. Especially as it was your first time out," she added, amid a chorus of sympathetic agreement from the other girls. "Not many people would have dared to try." Thank you very much," stuttered Paddington. He was still feeling as if he'd been for a ride on a particularly powerful pneumatic drill, and he gave Mr. Cheeseman a very hard stare indeed as he was helped down to the ground. "It's a shame, really," said Mrs. Brown, as they watched his progress back to the horse enclosure. "It would have made such a nice start to the day if he'd had a clear round." "Perhaps he'll do better in the Chase Me Charlie," said Jonathan hopefully. "He's down for that as well at the end." 452 faults indeed," snorted Mrs. Bird, as the commentator's voice boomed through the loudspeakers. "It's a good job he didn't tread on Paddington's hat. He'd have lost a good deal more than that." And giving a final glare in the direction of the judge's rostrum, the Browns' housekeeper began busying herself with the picnic basket. "Oh, that's a good idea," said Jonathan. "I'm so hungry I could eat a horse." "Pity you didn't eat Paddington's," said Mr. Brown gloomily, "especially after that last round." "Shh, Henry," whispered Mrs. Brown. "Here he comes. We don't want to upset him any more." Paddington had worked up quite an appetite, though for once he seemed more interested in Mr. Gruber's book on riding, which he'd brought with him in case of an emergency, rather than in the actual food itself. Several times he dipped his paw into the bowl of salad dressing in mistake for the marmalade, as he studied a particularly interesting chapter on jumping which he hadn't read before. And apart from suddenly rearing up into the air once or twice as he went through the motions, he remained remarkably quiet. It wasn't until nearly the end of the meal, when he absent-mindedly reached into the basket and helped himself to one of Mrs. Bird's meringues, that he showed any signs of life at all. "Aren't they delicious?" said Mrs. Brown. "I don't think I've ever tasted better." "Don't you like them, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Bird, looking most concerned at the expression on his face. Yes, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington politely. They're very unusual. I think I'll put some marmalade on to take the taste... Paddington's voice trailed away. Although not wishing to say so, he didn't think much of Mrs. Bird's meringue at all, and he was glad it was particularly small and dainty. It was really most unusual, for Mrs. Bird was an extremely good cook, and her cakes normally melted in the mouth, whereas the present one not only showed signs of not melting, but was positively stringy. And it wasn't just the texture. Paddington couldn't make up his mind if it was because he'd followed the ice cream with another helping of Russian salad, or whether Mr. Brown had accidentally spilt some paraffin over it when he'd filled the picnic stove. But whatever the reason, Mrs. Bird's meringue was very odd indeed, and not even a liberal splodge of marmalade entirely took the taste away. However, Paddington was a polite little bear, and he had no wish to offend anyone, least of all Mrs. Bird. So he manfully carried on. Fortunately, he was saved any further embarrassment by Gay Cheeseman announcing that the final event on the programme was about to take place and asking the competitors to come forward. Hastily cramming the remains of the meringue into his mouth, Paddington gathered up his book and sponsor sheet and hurried off in the direction of the saddling enclosure, closely followed by Judy and several of her friends. "I know one thing," said Mr. Brown, as Paddington disappeared from view into the crowd. "If he manages to get over one fence, the swimming pool fund won't do too badly. He's got enough signatures now to float a battleship." For various reasons, Paddington's sponsor sheet had grown considerably during the course of the afternoon. Apart from a number of people who'd added their names a second time to show that they hadn't lost faith, there was now a considerable new element who had signed for quite a different reason, sensing that in backing Paddington they could show willing without too great an expense. And his sheet was now jam-packed with signatures. "It would serve some of 'em right if he did do well," said Mrs. Bird darkly. "It might teach them a lesson." Mrs. Bird looked as if she'd been about to add a great deal more, but at that moment a burst of applause heralded the first of a long line of competitors. The Chase Me Charlie event was one in which all the contestants formed up in a circle, their horses nose to tail, and took it in turns to jump a single pole. Only one fault was allowed, and each time a round had been completed, those with faults dropped out, and the pole was raised another inch until the final winner emerged. Practically everyone who could ride was taking part, and the circle of horses stretched right round the field, so that it was some time before Paddington came into view on Black Beauty. There was a nasty moment when he came past the Browns and tried to raise his hat, which he'd insisted on wearing on top of his compulsory riding one, but he soon righted himself and disappeared from view again, holding the reins with one paw and anxiously consulting Mr. Gruber's book, which he still held in the other. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown nervously. "I do hope he takes care. I didn't like to say so in his presence, but it must be terribly difficult with short legs. No wonder his paws keep coming out of the stirrups." "I shouldn't worry," said Mrs. Bird. "There's one thing about bears. They always fall on their feet, no matter what happens." Mrs. Bird did her best to sound cheerful, but she looked as worried as anyone as they waited for Paddington to make his first jump. Judy arrived back just in the nick of time, and in the excitement only Mrs. Bird's sharp eyes noticed that she, too, was now wearing a very odd expression on her face. An expression, moreover, which was almost identical to the one Paddington had worn a little earlier, when he'd had trouble with his meringue. But before she had time to look into the matter, her attention was drawn back to the field as a great roar went up from the crowd. The Browns watched in amazement as Paddington and Black Beauty literally sailed over the pole. One moment they'd been trotting gently towards it, and then Paddington appeared to lean forward and whisper something in the horse's ear. The very next instant, horse and rider leapt into the air and cleared the hurdle with several feet to spare. Admittedly, the pole was at its lowest mark, but even so the performance drew a gasp of astonishment from the onlookers. "Bravo!" cried someone near the Browns. "Oh, bravo! That bear's done it at last. Yeah, not even a sign of a refusal." "Heavens above!" exclaimed Mr. Brown, twirling his moustache with excitement. "Oh, if he carried on like that, he'll be up among the leaders in no time. Did you see it? He went higher than anyone." Jonathan listened to his sister as she whispered in his ear. "If he does it again," she said gloomily. "Well, even if he doesn't, he's certainly not bottom this time," said Mrs. Brown thankfully, as a following rider brought the pole down with a clatter. And as it happened, their worst fears went unrealized, for seeming miracle began to follow miracle as Paddington and Black Beauty made one effortless clear round after another, and one by one the other competitors began to drop out. Each time they drew near the jump, Paddington leaned over and appeared to whisper something in Black Beauty's ear, and each time it had a magical effect as she bounded into action and, with a whinny which echoed round the cloisters, cleared the hurdle with feet to spare. Paddington was so excited he discarded Mr. Gruber's book in order to raise his hat in acknowledgment of the cheers, and even those who'd signed his sheet rather late in the day, although they wore long faces at first, began applauding with the rest. And when it came to the final round, with Paddington pitted against Diana Ridgway, the head girl, the excitement was intense. Even with loyalties so divided, the cheer which rang out as Paddington emerged the victor practically shook the school to its foundations. And Diana Ridgway herself set the seal on the occasion by dismounting and running over to offer her congratulations. Gay Cheeseman so far forgot the unpleasantness earlier in the day that phrases like "superb horsemanship," "splendid display," and "supreme example of rider and mount being as one" floated round the grounds with scarcely a pause for breath. For some reason or other, Diana Ridgway appeared to have second thoughts as Paddington leaned down to speak to her, but with an obvious effort she overcame them, and in the general excitement the moment passed practically unnoticed. "What an incredible business!" exclaimed Mr. Brown, mopping his brow as he settled down again. "I wonder what on earth Paddington kept whispering to Black Beauty. It must have been something pretty good to make her want to jump like that." Jonathan and Judy exchanged glances. Then Judy took a deep breath. "I'm not sure he whispered anything," she began, only to break off again as she suddenly caught sight of Paddington and the head-mistress about to converge a short distance away. "Crikey, that's torn it," said Jonathan, as Miss Grimshaw began pumping Paddington's paw up and down. "Stout effort," she cried. "Allow me to shake you by the paw. You've given our swimming pool a tremendous fillip." Paddington began to look more and more surprised as he listened to the headmistress. He had no idea they'd dug the hole, let alone filled it up. "I hope I haven't filled it too full, Miss Grimshaw," he exclaimed politely. Miss Grimshaw's smile seemed to become strangely fixed, and then she paused and gave a sniff. "I really must get Birchwood to look at the drains," she said, eyeing Paddington even more doubtfully. I hope we shall meet again at the presentation." "Crumbs," said Judy, as the headmistress hurried on her way. "The presentation! We'd better do something before then." Dashing over to Paddington, she grabbed hold of his paw and then turned to her brother. "Come on, Jonathan. We'll take him to see Matron. She's just over there in the first aid tent. She may be able to give him something." "Matron?" echoed Mrs. Brown as Judy began whispering in Paddington's ear. What on earth are they on about? It's all right, Mrs. Brown, said Paddington. It's nothing serious. I'm afraid I'm having trouble with one of Mrs. Bird's meringues. Trouble with one of my meringues? Mrs. Bird began to look thoughtful as Judy and Jonathan whisked Paddington away. How many did the children have? She asked, rummaging in the picnic basket. 3 each, I think, replied Mrs. Brown. I remember them talking about it. Jonathan wanted another, but there weren't any left. I had 2, the same as you. She turned to her husband. How many did you have, Henry? 4, said Mr. Brown. Well, they were a bit Moorish. So that's 4, and children had 3, so 6, and 5, 10. It's a 2 for you, and 2 for me. Well, that makes 14 altogether, said Mrs. Bird, as she began emptying the contents of the picnic basket. And that's all I made, she added ominously. So whatever that bear ate, it certainly wasn't a meringue. Mr. Brown wound down the window of his car to its fullest extent and then glanced across at Paddington. How anyone could mistake a head of garlic for a meringue, I just don't know, he said. Especially one of Mrs. Bird's, said Judy. Matron couldn't believe her ears. Or her nose, added Jonathan. Paddington looked at them sheepishly. I'm afraid I was busy reading about my cavalettis, he explained. That's to do with jumping. I didn't notice I'd made a mistake until it was too late. But a whole head, said Mrs. Brown from behind her handkerchief. I mean, a clove would have been bad enough, but a whole head. No wonder Black Beauty was jumping so well, said Judy. Every time you leaned over her, she must have got the full force. It's a wonder she didn't go into orbit, agreed Jonathan. The Browns were making all possible speed in the direction of Windsor Gardens, but even with all the windows open, there was a decided air about the car. Paddington had been standing on the front seat with his head poking out of the sunshine roof for most of the way, and every time they stopped, they got some very funny looks indeed from any passers-by who happened to be downwind. I'll say one thing, remarked Mr. Brown as they drew to a halt alongside a policeman, who hastily waved them on again. It soon clears the traffic. I don't think we've ever made better time. Perhaps I could eat some garlic when we go out again, Mr. Brown, said Paddington, anxious to make amends. Mr. Brown gave a shudder. No, thank you. Once is quite enough. Anyway, broke in Judy, all's well that ends well. There were over 200 signatures on Paddington's sheet, and Miss Grimshaw reckons it must be worth at least as many pounds to the fund. Mr. Cheeseman said he'd never seen anything like it before, said Jonathan. Nor will he again if I have anything to do with it, said Mrs. Bird grimly. That's the last time I make any meringues. In the chorus of dismay which greeted this last remark, Paddington's voice was loudest of all. Perhaps you could make them extra large, Mrs. Bird. Then they won't get mistaken. The Browns' housekeeper remained silent for a moment. All in all, despite everything, it had been a most enjoyable day, and she was the last person to want to spoil it. Well, perhaps you're right, she said, relenting at last. But you must promise not to go riding on the poof when we get home. Paddington didn't take long to make up his mind. Although he was much too polite to say so, the events of the day were beginning to catch up on him, and sitting down, even on the softest poof, was the last thing he had in mind. I think, he announced amid general laughter as he clambered up on the seat again, I think I shall go to sleep standing up tonight. Next morning, Mr. Gruber had a good laugh when he heard about Paddington's exploits at the gymkhana. "It's strange you should have spent your day riding a horse, Mr. Brown. You see, I spent most of mine tinkering with what's known as a horseless carriage." Leading the way across the patio at the back of his shop towards a nearby mews stable, which he normally reserved for emergency supplies of antiques during the busy tourist season, Mr. Gruber threw open the wide double doors, and then stood back and waited patiently while Paddington accustomed his eyes to the gloom. "It's what is known as an old crock, Mr. Brown," he said impressively. "Is it really?" said Paddington politely. Although he didn't like to say so, the object of Mr. Gruber's fond gaze seemed very aptly named. From the little he could make out, it looked for all the world like a very old boiler on wheels, to which an enormously tall push-chair had been added as a kind of afterthought. Mr. Gruber chuckled as he caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. "I thought it might puzzle you, Mr. Brown," he said. "I don't suppose you've ever seen anything quite like it before. It's a very early steam-driven motor car, one of the first ever made, in fact. I came across it quite by chance the other week, and I've been keeping it as a surprise." Paddington's eyes grew wider and wider as Mr. Gruber went on to explain about early motor cars and how valuable some of them had become over the years, and he listened with growing interest to the story of the first horseless carriages. Knowing how crowded the present-day London streets were, it was difficult to picture the scene as Mr. Gruber described it, and he was most surprised to learn that cars used to have someone walking in front of them carrying a red flag. Mr. Gruber, who was obviously very proud of his stroke of good fortune, turned to his new machine and gave it a fond pat. "I doubt if there's another one quite like it in the whole of England, Mr. Brown," he said impressively. "I'm afraid it's in a bit of a state at this moment because it spent most of its life in a hay barn. But if you can spare the time, I did wonder if we could do it up between us." For once in his life, Paddington was at a loss for words. Although Mr. Brown sometimes let him clean the family car, and on very rare occasions gave him a spanner to hold, he'd never before been asked to actually help in doing one up. Oh, yes, please, Mr. Gruber," he exclaimed. But Mr. Gruber had kept his most exciting piece of news until last. "There's a big festival taking place in the Portobello Road in September," he continued, closing the stable door as he led the way back to his shop. "It's called International Week, and it's for the benefit of all the overseas visitors. On the last day, there's even going to be a fair and a grand parade through the market." Well, as they settled down again, Mr. Gruber looked at Paddington thoughtfully over the top of his glasses. "If we manage to get the car finished in time," he said casually, I did wonder if we could enter it." Paddington stared at his friend in amazement. Over the years, Mr. Gruber had sprung a good many surprises, but this one surpassed all his previous efforts. And bidding him goodbye, Paddington hurried back in the direction of Windsor Gardens in order to tell the others. What with dismantling the engine and rebuilding it, rubbing down the coachwork ready for repainting and varnishing, polishing the boiler and refurnishing the leather seats, time flew by at an alarming rate, and the gap between Mr. Gruber's first announcement and the day of the actual parade rapidly narrowed. Towards the end, practically everyone became involved in one way or another, and most nights found Paddington spreading newspapers on his bedroom floor so that he could catch up on polishing some of the many smaller bits and pieces before he went to bed. During all this time, a great change came over the market itself. Shop windows that had remained untouched for years suddenly took on a new lease of life, and some of the more recent establishments dealing in old army uniforms and other colourful relics of a bygone era began to look very gay indeed. Flags and bunting blossomed from bedroom windows, and coloured lights appeared across the narrow street, so that altogether it was not unlike the transformation scene in a Christmas pantomime. One evening, Paddington arrived home later than usual, and his news that Mr. Gruber's old crock was ready at long last gave rise to great excitement in the Brown household. "I know one thing," said Mrs. Bird, when the clamour had died down. "If you're going to be in the grand parade tomorrow, you'd better have a good bath and get rid of all that oil and grease. You'll never win a prize otherwise." "You can use some of Mr. Brown's bubble mixture as a treat if you like," said Mrs. Brown, ignoring the dark glances from her husband. Paddington, who wasn't normally too keen on baths, brightened considerably at the news. He'd had his eye on Mr. Brown's jar of bubble mixture for some time. According to the label on the side, even a single cupful of the secret ingredients produced undreamed-of magical results, and although Mr. Brown himself had managed to get through almost half the bottle with little outward sign of change, Paddington felt sure it was worth a go, particularly if it helped Mr. Gruber win a prize. Carefully making sure no one was around, he added several extra helpings to his bathwater that night in order to make sure the effect lasted until the following day. When he arrived down for breakfast next morning, everyone had to admit they'd never seen him looking quite so silky before. "It almost seems a pity to cover it up," said Mrs. Brown as she helped him on with his duffel coat. "If it was a shiny fur competition, you'd be bound to win first prize." The Browns weren't the only ones to be impressed by Paddington's appearance, and as Mr. Gruber's old crock steamed into position a little later on, its polished paint and brasswork gleaming in the morning sun, quite a few of the early morning spectators gave him a special round of applause. Mr. Gruber gave a tactful cough as they dismounted. "Why don't you take a look round, Mr. Brown? I have to take one of the front wheels off to make some last-minute adjustments, but I shall be quite all right on my own." Paddington hesitated for a moment, torn between helping his friend and investigating some of the other exciting things that were going on around him. But Mr. Gruber clinched the matter by helping him off with his coat. "I should make the most of it, Mr. Brown. You're only young once." Paddington needed no second bidding, and a few moments later he joined the crowds already thronging the area. Paddington consulted his programme with interest. Although he couldn't quite picture himself shining in the high jump, or even the long one, come to that, there were several other items which interested him, including one called Tossing the Caber. Now, the prize for this particular event was a free supply of buns for a month at his local baker's. It seemed very good value indeed, and although Paddington wasn't at all sure what a caber was, he felt quite certain he could toss one, given half a chance. Going up to a man wearing a kilt, he tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'd like to toss your caber, if I may." The man in charge looked Paddington up and down.
"I hope you ken what you're taking on," he said dolefully. "It's no for the like of young Sassenach bears."
"Sassenach bears?" repeated Paddington, giving the man a hard stare. "I'm not a Sassenach bear. I'm from darkest Peru. Besides, Mrs. Bird often lets me have a go with her pancakes."
"Pancakes?"
The man stared at Paddington as if he could hardly believe his ears.
"Oh, well," he said at last, "be it on your own head, so long as it's no on mine," he added. "Put your paws together. Bend your knees, close your eyes, and take it steady. We're no wanting to start the day with your young bear's rupture."
Looking more and more surprised, Paddington did as he was bidden. For a while, all he could hear was a lot of grunting and groaning, and he was about to stand up again when what seemed like a ton weight suddenly landed on his paws. Opening his eyes in order to see what was going on, he nearly fell over backwards with astonishment. Or rather, he would have fallen over if his paws hadn't been pinned to the ground by what appeared to be an enormous telegraph pole. But if the whole thing looked frightening at first sight, it was nothing compared to the situation a few seconds later when he heaved the pole in the air in order to try and free himself. For a brief moment all was well, and a ripple of applause ran round the assembly. But almost at once things started to go wrong. Hearing the cries of alarm as the pole began to fall, Paddington hurried after it as fast as he could, only to feel it start to topple in the opposite direction. The man in charge jumped back.
"Oh, hey!" he shouted. "Take it away, it's all yours."
"I don't think I want it any more, thank you very much," gasped Paddington, turning to the speaker. But it was too late. The man had disappeared, and instead words of advice and encouragement began to rain on him from all sides.
"Watch out! Brace yourself! Lift Paul down a bit!"
Well, there were so many different instructions, he couldn't even begin to remember half of them, let alone decide which one to act on first. And then, just as he was beginning to give up all hope of ever being saved, he heard a familiar voice rising above the others.
"Over here, Mr. Brown!" shouted Mr. Gruber. "Over here!"
Like a drowning man clutching at a straw, Paddington closed his eyes, heaved the pole for all it was worth, and then let go. He wasn't quite sure what happened next. For an instant, everything went black, and the whole world seemed to turn upside down. Then there was a tremendous thud and a clang, followed by silence. "Oh, dear Mr. Brown," said a voice, as a willing pair of hands helped him to his feet. "Oh, I'm afraid this is all my fault. If I hadn't called you when I did, it would never have happened." Paddington opened his eyes and stared round in alarm, but to his relief, Mr. Gruber's car still seemed to be in one piece. "It's a good job the pole hit this wheel and not the car itself," said Mr. Gruber, picking up a twisted piece of metal. "Otherwise it really would have been an old crock. But I'm very much afraid it's put paid to our chances of entering the grand parade," he added ruefully. Paddington's face grew longer and longer as he took in Mr. Gruber's words. "Perhaps we could try running it on 3 wheels," he suggested, hopefully. Mr. Gruber shook his head. "It's been known," he said. "In fact, I do believe there's someone who holds the record for running a car on 2 wheels. But we would need a very large weight on the back seat to balance things up, and I doubt if we can get one in time. Jonathan and Judy certainly won't be heavy enough, and there's only 10 minutes to go before the start." Mr. Gruber broke off, for much to his surprise his words seemed to be having a strange effect. One moment Paddington was standing in front of him, forlornly eyeing the squashed remains of the wheel, and the next moment he was galvanized into action, rather as if he'd suddenly received an electric shock. "Not be a moment, Mr. Gruber," he called. "I've just had an idea." The object of Paddington's attention was a large stage which lay towards the back of the fair. However, it wasn't so much the stage or the ropes surrounding it that had set his mind to work, but a large poster hanging overhead. It was labelled 2-ton muscles galore, and it showed a view of the largest man he could ever remember seeing. Paddington didn't know what Muscles Galore did for a living, or why he was at the fair, but if his picture was anything to go by, and he sat in the back of Mr. Gruber's car, there would be no possibility whatsoever of it falling over. As he climbed through the ropes onto the stage, Paddington was surprised to hear a cheer ring out, and he paused for a moment in order to raise his hat at the crowd below, before hurrying across to the far corner where a man in leopard-skin tights was sitting. "Excuse me, Mr. Galore," he began, politely holding out his paw. "I was wondering—" The rest of Paddington's words died before they even reached his lips. He wasn't quite sure how it happened, or why, for that matter, but somewhere a bell clanged, and he suddenly found himself flying through the air towards the ropes on the far side of the stage, almost as if he'd been shot from a cannon. It felt like a ride on a helter-skelter, a moon rocket and a dodgem car all rolled into one, and to his alarm, no sooner had he recovered from his first shock than he caught sight of Muscles Galore advancing towards him with a most unfriendly look in his eye. "Would you like a second?" whispered a hoarse voice in his ear. Paddington looked round and found he was being addressed by a man with a towel round his neck. "I didn't even want the first, thank you very much," he said hotly. "Lay into him!" shouted someone in the crowd. "Tear him apart!" Paddington wasn't quite sure whether the remark was intended for him or 2-ton Muscles Galore, but he didn't stop to find out. Pulling his hat firmly down over his head, he slithered past his opponent and hurried round the ring in an effort to find the nearest exit. He was only just in the nick of time, for there was a loud twang behind him as Muscles Galore landed against the ropes and bounced off again, landing with a heavy thud on the floor. The roar which greeted Paddington's narrow escape was equalled only by the growl from 2-ton Muscles as his outstretched hands grasped at the empty air. "First rate," said someone, pushing Paddington back into the ring as he tried to clamber through the ropes. "I don't think I'd want to stay in the ring with a great brute like that just for the sake of £1 a minute." "Not for £50, agreed someone else. "I'd like to live to spend it. Still, it's the best so far today, isn't it? Yeah, by my reckoning, that young bear is £2 up already." Paddington stared at the speaker in amazement. Far from wanting to earn £1 for every minute spent in the ring with Muscles Galore, he would have willingly foregone quite a few weeks' bun money in order to stay out. But before he had time to think too deeply about the matter, he felt a vice-like grip encircle his waist, and for a second time in as many minutes he found himself hurtling through the air. "Here," called Muscles Galore as he staggered back against the ropes. "Here, he's all slippery. He's coated himself with something." "Get on with it!" shouted someone in the crowd. The chanting of the crowd seemed to act like a red rag to a bull on Muscles Galore, and for the next few minutes Paddington was hard put to keep ahead of him, let alone make good his escape from the ring as they tore round and round. How long it would have gone on was impossible to say, for as fast as 2-ton Muscles Galore caught up with Paddington and grabbed hold of him, he slipped from his grasp again, and it was really more a question of who could hold out the longest. But as it happened, matters were suddenly decided for them in the shape of a stern figure emerging from the crowd brandishing an umbrella. Ignoring the boos from the rougher element, who would willingly have seen the contest go on all day, Mrs. Bird climbed into the ring. "Stop these goings-on at once!" she commanded, glaring at Paddington's opponent. "Muscles Galore, indeed! You ought to be ashamed of yourself, chasing a young bear like that." "Well, it wasn't really Mr. Galore's fault, Mrs. Bird," gasped Paddington urgently. "And it wasn't his muscles I was after. It was his tons." With only seconds to go before the start of the grand parade, Paddington wasn't at all sure if he could get 2-ton Muscles Galore to the car in time, let alone explain why he wanted him. He gave a deep sigh as he tried to gather his breath. "If you'd like to come and sit on Mr. Gruber's back seat, Mr. Galore," he announced generously, "I'll give you back my winnings." 2-ton Muscles Galore needed no second bidding. In fact, he looked quite pleased to leave the ring, and a moment later, with Paddington leading and Mrs. Bird bringing up the rear, they were pushing their way through the crowd in the direction of Mr. Gruber's car as fast as they could go. After all the excitement and the strange sight of Mr. Gruber's old crock heading the procession on 3 wheels, its bonnet adorned by the enormous blue winner's rosette and the back seat by the equally huge figure of Mr. Galore, the events that followed proved something of an anticlimax. Both Paddington and Mr. Gruber were well-known figures in the market, and it was a popular result. But long after the parade was over, and the last of the fair was being packed up and ready to leave, the main talking point was Paddington's exploits in the ring. Even Muscles Galore himself made a special point of shaking him by the paw before he left. "Such a nice gentleman," said Mrs. Bird, surprisingly, as she waved goodbye. "Yes, quite one of the old school," agreed Mr. Gruber. "I think he and young Mr. Brown were very well matched. With odds on Mr. Brown, of course," he added hastily. "Fancy staying in the ring with him for 10 whole minutes, though," exclaimed Jonathan. "I wouldn't have fancied it." "The man who ran the booth announced it was a record," broke in Judy. "Yes, Mr. Galore said that I'm what they call a southpaw," explained Paddington. "That's most unusual." The Browns exchanged glances. There was a peculiar gleam in Paddington's eye, and it was noticeable that they were being given an extra wide berth by the other passers-by as they made their way home. "I must say, it's nice to feel in such safe paws," said Mrs. Bird, as Paddington aimed a particularly hard stare at a nearby shadow. "Especially late at night." "What are you going to do when you get home, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown, jokingly. "Have half an hour with a medicine ball, or do some press-ups?" Paddington directed his stare in Mr. Brown's direction. "I think," he said, to everyone's astonishment, "I think I shall have a nice hot bath." "Good gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Wonders will never cease." But Paddington had other things on his mind. Thinking back over the day's events, he decided that the thing that had impressed him most of all was the outcome of the previous night's bubble bath. The result of only a few capfuls had surpassed anything forecast on the side of the jar, and there was no knowing what might happen if he used the rest in one go. "My fur's very dusty, Mr. Brown," he announced hopefully, "so I think I shall need plenty of your mixture to put it right."